Welcome back to the studio. It's been a busy week here. After filming all of the segments for the Fanfare blocks, of which we used 3 different ones in the body and the pillow tuck for this Crown of Thorns quilt, I decided I was going to go ahead and split it into 2 parts. So this video will be on putting in the panto. The panto basically will be behind, in my mind, behind the body of the quilt, just on the border. So where the pillow tuck is, there will be a no-sew zone, and where the body of the quilt is will be a larger no-sew zone, or actually several no-sew zones, so that I can go ahead and use the panto only on the border. It will run side to side, and in my mind that will be behind the blocks. It won't appear on the blocks because we've already quilted all of that. When I started the process for this quilt, I didn't realize there was a pillow tuck, and I was going to show how to do the corners and borders on design rather than using a panto at all. The panto would have just been running on all 4 sides rather than filling the whole field. But the pillow tuck changed that, because the pillow tuck is a different size, it's a different width than the body of the quilt, and so the 4 sides around the pillow tuck, there's 2 different measurements. There may even be 3. 1 on the top, the 2 on the sides, and the 1 below it are various sizes, and then on the 2 sides of the body of the quilt and the bottom are different sizes as well. So the panto seems to be the best way to get it to work. I wanted to use the same design theme that I had in the blocks, and that's why I spent so much time selecting this particular quilting design, because it had a panto, it had a 1/4 square triangle, a 1/2 square triangle, and a alternate block, all that were of a close approximation of the size that I needed, so I didn't have to size them up or down too much. I also wanted the alternate block to be a square, so it actually filled the whole block in, instead of creating kind of a voided space around the wreath that I might have wanted to go back in and have to fill in later. I didn't want to have to do that. So far, I have to say the quilt is coming out really nicely. The owner of the quilt was with me when we were selecting thread. We did it the day that we had the quilt, and we picked the backing, so the thread on the backing is almost invisible. You can't hardly see it at all, which is my favorite way of doing things. Very low contrast. In the background of the blocks, it shows up just enough for the design to show up, but it doesn't scream across the room, so I'm really happy with that. It matches the background fabric really beautifully. It's a very light kind of teal aqua color, and so that's working well. So today what we're going to do is create the panto for the whole quilt, and then as we go down through the rows, we're going to create no-sew zones. Again, I'm going to be using a ruler against the foot of the quilt as I do it to get really accurate placement on my no-sew zone. I know that one of the big things that could happen with a no-sew zone and a larger quilt is that the quilt will shrink as it's being sewn in. I've already done the body, so I don't have to worry about that shrinking it in. If it was going to shrink, it already did, because I'm finished. But I'm still going to go 1/4 of an inch outside of the block that I want, and then when the whole thing is finished, I'm going to come back and just do straight line stitching right over the top of that, so it creates a full line 1/4 of an inch away from the 2 no-sew zones, the pillow tuck and the body of the quilt. And because the thread more closely matches the border fabric, it's mostly going to be invisible there anyway. It's mostly just adding texture. So that's the process that we're going to be doing today. I had a couple other things that I had to do this week. I'm going to be the best man in a wedding in December, so I had to get out the old tape measure and measure myself. I haven't had a suit jacket probably in close to 15 years, maybe 20. And I'm sure some people may have noticed that I've gained weight over this last couple years. So putting this thing around my body was a real sad experience. I can't believe I wasn't even close to what I thought I was, but I'm glad I got that out before I ordered a jacket. And to commiserate, I have myself some tea and my favorite cookies. I know those two things don't make sense together, but those helped me get over that. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll reposition the camera. I've done rehearsed on this as much as I could do several times, and I will tell you why. One of the things that always trips me up is the zoom on the IQ. And in my mind, the best way to explain how the zoom works is when you were a kid and you played Simon Says, because if you don't do it exactly the way it says, the way Simon says, then it doesn't work. I'm always zooming in and then forgetting to turn zoom off. And then I try and move the quilt or clip something or combine something, and it's still in zoom, and all it's doing is zooming in crazy ways. And it's the same with zoom out. So I've had to actually write it down. I constantly am getting ahead of myself and forgetting that I'm in zoom mode and that I can't do anything else except zoom in zoom mode. So I've practiced it several times, but there's only so far you can practice without actually doing it because you're not rolling the quilt up. So I hope that I'm clear today. I know my goal is to be clear. So we're going to go ahead and move the camera, and I will turn the IQ on and the Bernina on, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. I really would like to get this finished today or tomorrow so I could give Marguerite back her quilt, because I know it's getting close to the end of the month, and I know she'll want to put the binding on it and bring it to our next Quilt Guild meeting. She always does that. And she could put a binding on a king-size quilt in a day. I would want to break that up. But anyway, I want to give her time enough to get the binding on so that we could take it to our next Quilt Guild meeting. So we're going to go ahead and get that started today. Because of the size of this quilt, my start point for the IQ is almost behind the column. So it's making it a little bit harder to film this segment, but I'm going to try and do it. I'm on the right side instead of the left side, which I'm more comfortable with, but it is what it is. So I'm going to design my quilt for the panto. So I'm going to select Design Sew Quilt, Start New, Yes, Erase, Reset. I'm going to do a pantograph, and I'm going to enter my rectangle manually. This quilt has a little bit of character to it, so it changes a little bit as it goes down the quilt on the width. And I have my papers here somewhere. Let's see. It was 96. 96 is what I originally had written down, but when I measured it, I have anywhere from 91 to 94. So I'm going to go ahead and keep the 96 width, just so that I have plenty of extra space on both sides of the quilt. So that's my width, 96. For my height, I have 114, so I'm going to go up to 120. Just so I know that I've got plenty of space. I could always adjust the bottom when I get down there. And I am starting a full inch above and a full inch and a half to the left as I'm starting. So I know that I've got plenty of space to do the whole quilt. I'm going to go ahead and hit finished. And I know my pattern for Fanfare is still in my downloads because I haven't cleaned up my library for a while. So I'm going to go to downloads, F for Fanfare, and I have my Fanfare here. It says Fanfare Grande 10. The 10 is an indication of the height that the designer intended for this panto. When I am bringing in a pattern, when I'm saving it, I apologize, that was my brother calling. So when I download a pattern from Elementz, the beginning part of the pattern always has the inventory control number. So I always remove that from the name of the pattern, and then I look up on the website what the original height of the design was intended to be, and I include that at the end of the name, so I know when I pull it up on the IQ what size it was intended. And all of my patterns that have that information available have that number added to the end of the pattern. So Fanfare Grande 10, I'm going to select it and hit continue. So that was the even rows. Now I'm going to select it again for the odd rows, and you can see I have Fanfare now on the IQ, and there's a gap in between. So we're going to erase the gap by selecting gap. You can hit the up and down arrows. I'm just going to go ahead and use my finger, and I'm just going to get that to the point where I like it, where it's fuzzy. It doesn't look like there's any kind of space that's too large in between the rows. And now I'm going to go back, because here where it says row height, pattern height, the row height is 12 inches, the pattern height is 14.286. Well, I know I want to get that pattern height down to 10 or close to it. So I'm going to select the row height. It doesn't allow you to select the pattern height directly, but by affecting the row height, I can affect the pattern height. So again, I could go up and down. I could put in a number on the keyboard, but keeping in mind that it's affecting the row height number, not the pattern height. Or I could just slide my finger. So by sliding my finger and then adjusting with the up and down, I'm going to get as close as I can to that 10 inches. And so right now I'm at 10.03. But I might actually go back up to 10.5. It's not going to be a huge adjustment, but it may allow me to do maybe one less row. So I've got it at 10.494. I'm going to go ahead and say finished. And what I'm going to do is change my transition type on the edges to continuous by selecting the plus or minus button. So I have continuous. I'm going to accept and confirm that I'm accepting that transition. And now, while I have this, I'm going to save this quilt pattern so that if I make any mistakes later in the no-sew zones, I can always go back to the original pattern that I saved and keep it from there. So I'm going to save and rename the quilt, and it's just going to be Fanfare. And enter, continue. I put it in my work in progress, so here it is. So now I can go ahead and work with this quilt, and if I make a mistake with the clipping or the combining or the no-sew zone, I can always go back and open this pattern back up, and I don't have to guess at what my gap was or the size of the panto. It's already saved as a backup. I can then delete that later when I don't need it anymore. So I'm going to I'm going to edit a block, I'm going to add a block, and I'm going to add a no-sew zone. So it's asking me to select the rows that are going to be affected by this no-sew zone. And the first couple times I practiced this, it was the first 3 rows that are impacted at the top. So I'm just going to go ahead and select those and hit continue. I'm going to mark on the quilt, and then I can go ahead and move the camera and get out of this corner. So I've made a little dot on the batting where my start needle position was, just in case I need that later, so I can get the same start position later. I've just made a little black dot with a Pigma pen on the batting. So I'm going to go ahead and move the quilt head, the machine head, over to where my first no-sew zone is, but I'm going to remove the camera now because I know you can't see where I'm going to do a no-sew zone. I can see that I've selected 3 rows of red panto. They all show up here in red, or what I'm going to be affected. And the crosshairs will show that it's just very little bit of row 3. But I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to use a machine quilting ruler along the edge of my ruler foot, and I have my ruler base on. I'm going to use this. The ruler is going to be exactly on the edge, the pieced edge between the inner border and the outer border. That means when my hopping foot hits the ruler, I'm going to be 1/4 of an inch away from that. So my no-sew zone is going to extend 1/4 of an inch outside of the inner border that is surrounding the pillow tuck. And I'm going to give myself as many points as I need to around the quilt, around the pillow tuck. So I'm marking on quilt. I'm going to hit OK. The ruler is just giving me really accurate straight lines for the no-sew zone. And I'm just going to continue this around to the other side. I won't be able to go down far enough, so I'm just, when I get to the far right hand side at the bottom, I'm just going to go ahead and click close block, which you won't be able to see because I'll be off the camera view by then. So you can see on the quilt that I have a red box now that's going to be my no-sew zone. As soon as I hit finished, it's going to go ahead and delete all of the stitching inside of that block. So now you see that pink empty box is my pillow tuck, which includes both the inner border and the background blocks of the white and the pieced blocks that are the crown of thorns. And I've already done the fanfare in the 1/4 square triangles, the 1/2 square triangles, and I've stitched in the ditch on those blocks. So there's plenty of quilting in there. So at this point I can go ahead and hit finished. And it's asking me what kind of transition I want here, but I'm not going to hit continuous here because I don't want the machine to stitch across this empty space in any way. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the plus or minus until I get to a jump stitch or to a tie off. So and my threshold is set at 1 inch, which may be a little bit big, but on here you can see that there's lines where it's going to be having to go across the quilt, but at first I want to go ahead and either accept tie off or jump stitch, and I think I'm going to go ahead and use tie off and accept that. And now I'm going to modify, or am I adding a block? Let me read my notes. I hit finished. I'm going to add edit pattern, and I want to split the pattern, and then I can recombine it. But here's the tricky thing. I want to be able to see up there better, so I'm going to have to zoom. And so first I'm going to hit zoom off, and so now you see my zoom on is highlighted. This is the thing, this zoom. The zoom buttons always mess me up. Maybe I want to zoom out. Okay. Now I'm going to zoom back in. Okay, so now I can see these lines of blue across my no-sew zone. I want to go ahead and split those out. I'm touching the blue line and hitting split. I've got the upper right one done. I'm going to do this lower left one. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more so I can see there's another one here. I just have to keep remembering to turn the zoom off and back on again. I'm sure if some people are really adept at this, but I'm not. It confuses my head. So I'm going to split this last piece here. And there's a little bit up here I see now. So now I've looked at the whole pillow tuck, and I don't see any of the stitching on the block. But now I'm going to double check. I think I see. Okay, so now I have all of the stitching out of the block, out of the no-sew zone, but I want to go ahead and combine some of these rows back together again where they were broken apart. So I'm going to select, you can see here it's only got the first portion of it. I want to go ahead and have it connect to the whole top row. I'm going to stop to cut threads if needed. Now you can see I have these 2 ports. I'm going to add that one to it. Stop to cut threads and hit finished. The second part is 2 separate pieces, so I shouldn't have to connect those, but I'm going to go ahead and hit finished, and I'm going to go ahead and hit sew quilt. So I'm going to sew this first portion, the first top row, with my no sew zone. I'm going to move my papers out of the way, my ruler, my pen, and I can go ahead and hit continue. I don't have my needle down. The quilt is under tension. I have my lights on, so I should be good to go. I'm going to hit continue, sew quilt. And it's going to go off to one of the start positions. Because I didn't designate the start on the left-hand side, it started here on the third row, third portion of that top. So it's going to go ahead and stitch this out and then go back and do the other 2 pieces, which is okay. Again, because the thread is a low contrast for this border, any tiny mistakes on here aren't going to be very visible, but I don't have any so far, so I'm trying to err on that side. So I will bring you in a little bit closer so you can see what we're stitching, but I'm going to let this sew for a little bit. But I can sew the first and second row without rolling up, and then I'll have to realign and do another no sew zone. If I had paid closer attention, I could have changed my start and stop points on when I combine these 3 top pieces of the row, but in the end it's not going to have any real effect on anything except I had to stop and cut the thread one more time. So the machine is moved back to its second start position, which really should have been the original start position, and I've got my thread pulled up, so I'm going to go ahead and hit start. One thing I would say, every time I create a no sew zone, I start fresh with my changes that I made. So if I'm unhappy with the threshold that I made for the inside, I could change that. If I don't like the tie off and I want to go to a jump stitch, I could do that the next time. Since I realized that I didn't use the stop and start selection wisely, I can make that adjustment on my next no sew zone, because I'm going to be creating these all the way down the quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and hold my threads. I've got my machine on manual, so I'm going to hit start, and it's going to go ahead and start sewing out the top row again, but now it's going to be working on the left to right portion. When this gets a little bit closer to the middle where my camera can reach, I'm going to move the camera in. The battery's dead, so I have to have it plugged into the wall right now. But you'll be able to see in just a minute how we're reacting to that no sew zone. We're really close now to my no sew zone, and you can see that it's going to stop and allow me to pull up the thread on the machine, and I'm going to be clipping in between where it's going to jump from one place to the other. Now in between these gaps later, I'm going to come back and do a stitch, straight stitch around the whole thing, but I still didn't want it to do continuous stitching, because in the past it stitched straight across my no-sew zone. So I'm still learning, but I'm going to go ahead and let the machine move to its next position. And if I don't like the way this process works each time, then I can go ahead and adjust that for my next no-sew zone. Now this is the consequence of selecting a jump stitch or tie off when you're doing a transition like this. It will tell you how many of these you're going to have, and I think there was something like 36 total on this part of the process. But when you want to do something the best you can, sometimes you make a decision to go ahead and accept the consequences of that. And because I know that this quilt is really important to the owner, I'm willing to go ahead and do a little bit of extra work to make sure that I err on the right side. And it may be that when this is finished, I don't come back and do a straight line connecting all of this. I may just leave it as it is. But I will have the option to do that. So I'm going to continue on with these jump stitches and transitions until we get over to the right hand side where it's already stitched out. I just finished going across the top, and there were quite a few stops and starts where I had to clip the thread, and I can imagine that would be really tedious if there were no advantage to it. But I have done a no-sew zone in the past where I used continuous, and the buildup of stitching around the no-sew zone was so obvious that I was really unhappy with the outcome. This finishes with a very airy feel. There are a lot of stops and starts on there. It just looks like the pattern ends, but it doesn't have all that thread buildup. And with the beautiful airy way that these roses float on this background fabric, I'm really in love with the way it's finishing without a heavy-handed touch on the thread. So it was a little tedious to do, but I'm really thrilled with the visual outcome of it, and so I'm not bothered by that process. I know not every quilt somebody would want to do that on, but to me this is a special quilt for me, and I know it's a special quilt for the owner, so I don't mind doing it on this. So I've got the whole top row done. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit Sew Quilt and select the next pattern to sew, which is going to be the second row on the left hand side. So I'm going to hit continue and let the machine go ahead and zip over there. I have to go back. My start point is on the left hand side, so I'm going to go ahead and hit restart and just move over there. I've already clipped my thread. There's always a lot of balls in the air with things to think about when you're doing stitching. I did have my ruler base on. That was giving me an obstruction notice, but also I wasn't paying attention to how far the machine could sew. And so it can't get all of the second row. So I'm going to go ahead and roll the quilt up, realign it, and then we'll get started again with row 2. Well, the quilt has been rolled up and realigned. I'm hoping that we didn't affect the no-sew zone very much when we did that, but I'm going to go ahead and keep a close eye on that when we get over there. Right now we're sewing out a pretty big chunk, so I'm not going to let the video roll the whole time till we get over there, because that would probably be, well, it's going to be another 5 minutes just to do this section, and then we have to jump across and do the other half. So it says we have a thread break. I'm going to check and see if the bobbin's empty, and then I'll go ahead and pick up when we get closer to the no-sews. I did the 2 rows that had the no-sew zone that I could include for that size, but I have to increase the size of the no-sew zone because that portion wouldn't fit on the roller space. So I'm going to add edit pattern, add edit block. I'm going to add a block, and I'm going to add a no-sew zone. So I have to select the pattern that's going to be affected, which is this bottom one. And all of those pieces. I'm just double checking it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and hit continue, and I'm going to mark on quilt, but again I'm going to use my ruler to make sure I get really on the edge, and I'm going to go up above where I've already sewn just to make sure we're capturing that. I'm going to mark on quilt. I'm putting the edge of my ruler right on the edge of the seam for the inner and outer border. And this time I don't have my ruler base on, so I have to be really careful, but I'm not actually stitching here. So I am not worried about the machine sewing over the top of the ruler here. I'm just using the ruler to give me really precise marking points for the no-sew zone. I went ahead and closed the block so you can see where my new line is. I'm going to go ahead and hit finished, and you can see my new no-sew zone, and I'm going to hit finished again, and I have just a little bit of cleanup to do here, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process. I'm still using my tie off, even though it was a little bit tedious. I know that time is going to be cut down when I get to the body of the quilt, because there'll be a lot fewer of those, simply because I'm not running across the whole width of the quilt with it. But I'm going to go ahead and accept that, and I'm going to finish. Add edit and split pattern. Turn my zoom off. I'm going to split I'm having to get rid of this little piece, and it's got a lot of start and stops. So I'm going to hit delete until we get all of that. And we're almost there. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and split my pattern, and we'll go ahead and I don't think I need to combine any. I have the pattern split so there's no stitching over top of my no-sew zone. All I have to do is make sure when I'm adding or stitching the next row is to select all the components instead of worrying about combining them. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Sew Quilt. Select the first pattern. It's going to be this one, and I'm going to hit continue, and it's going to move over to the start, and I can go through the process of finishing out the no-sew zone around the pillow tuck. You can see we've already started skipping around the no-sew zone here. And I'm at my first spot where it's asking me to clip the thread. So I'm just going to raise the needle and hit start, and it's going to go over to the next one, and I can trim this thread when I get to the end. So I'm just going to keep advancing in this way until we get all the way across, and then at the end I can trim these threads on both the front and back. And this speeds up the process, but also I'm not getting a lot of overstitching on the edges of my no-sew zone. You also can see, or not see in this case, that the thread matches the fabric very well. It's a low contrast thread choice, so I like to do that, especially where I think I could make a small mistake. This will hide any mistakes by using a lower contrast thread. It's giving beautiful texture, but even on the back, the thread matches so beautifully that all you see is the puffiness. From the design, you don't really see the thread itself. This whole row is going to sew out in about 13 minutes. When I get past this top section, the two sides, this process will go a lot faster because I'm only sewing 10-inch sections per row. So instead of having 13 minutes, I might only have 2 or 3 minutes per row of stitching. You can see though, by adjusting the space in between how long it will go before it asks you to stop, that it can greatly reduce the amount of stitch time. I'm going to let you watch from back there the process of me just stopping, pulling up the needle and advancing to the next spot, and then I can always come back and trim these threads from where they jumped. I haven't used jump stitches before, so I don't exactly know how that works. So I was more comfortable stopping to trim the thread. Well, I've had a lot of interruptions in the studio today, which seems to be a recurring issue now that I have my mother living with me, so I'm dealing with my stuff and her stuff. So I haven't gotten as far on my end as I'd like. I did get all of the no-sew zone around the pillow tuck, and now I'm down to the body of the quilt. I have the no-sew zone, the first one done, which got me all the way across the top. And on my transitions, I went from 56 to 34 just by increasing the size. So I went from 1 inch to 1.5 inches allowance. Now I'm down onto the body of the quilt, and I'm only going to have the left and the right to worry about. So now I only have about 16. But each row, I'm going to have to make a new sew zone, which I've already done for the next row. But the sew out time is going to be very short for those because I only have that 10-inch section on the left and the right. I will clip the design in the middle, so it's two separate things. I'll select the left and then the right and then move down to the next one. Also, because this is a 10-inch pattern, I made it 10.5 inches, and my available quilting space is only 19.25 inches maximum. Without the ruler base, I can only get one row done at a time without rolling up the quilt and realigning. So each pass is that full setup. I have to sew both sides, stop, take the quilt out of tension, roll it up, realign it, add the new clipping block, and then get started again. But I'm frazzled out for today, so I'm going to pick it up tomorrow. I think tomorrow will go much faster because, again, I only have those 10-inch sections and I have to go to the bottom. I will say I'm really glad that I saved the quilt before I started, so I have something that I can always go back to and start from fresh if I have to, and it has all the same dimensionality as the original. Because I saved it. That's a really good tip for when you're trying new stuff, especially when you're having to use the back button like I am today to get back to add block and then add the clipping block. If you hit that one too many times, you're back to the start screen, and that's why it's good to save the quilt as a pattern. So I'm going to shut it down for today. It won't be any time for you, it'll just be a click. But I'll pick this back up tomorrow, and I hope to be a little clear-headed and finish this. I really don't want to go beyond tomorrow in getting this back to its owner because I want to give her plenty of time to put the binding on. I always trim her quilts before I give them back, and it's always my pleasure to do that. So I will see you in the blink of an eye, and hopefully I will be a little more rested, and we'll start again. And just like that, I was able to get over 8 hours of sleep, almost a full hour of deep sleep. I made dinner, and I made a full batch of Laura Bush's cowboy cookies, which I've already distributed. And now it's ready to get back to this. I feel clear-headed, and ready to go. So almost every single row I'm going to have to advance the quilt, I'm going to have to realign, and I'm going to create a new no-sew zone for that row. That way I could eliminate all of the body of the quilt, and in my mind it looks like the quilting design on the border goes underneath and pops back out on the border. So really happy about the way it's coming so far. No, well, I'm not even going to say that. I'm not even going to jinx myself. So I'm going to come around, we'll get the machine turned on. Could start doing that now. And I always unplug my machine just in case the surge protector doesn't work and we get some kind of storm. It is really gloomy today also here in the studio, so I have extra lighting on because the ambient outside lighting is not going to be a big plus today. So now all I have to do is turn on the IQ. Remember, I saved the whole quilt to start with, so I can open that up or an existing version of the quilt from that part of the program. Surface. So now we're ready. I'm going to design sew, edit existing, work in progress, continue. Do I want to save a backup? No, I don't need another backup. But at this point now I can touch a reference point on the screen because the software is asking me to realign. So I can go ahead, and I'll probably be off screen at this point. But I could select something that's already been sewn, and I'm going to zoom in. Turn my zoom off. I'm going to choose the very tip of the inside vein of this leaf, hit continue, and now I've realigned. Yesterday before I shut down, I had already created the no-sew zone for this row, so I can now hit sew quilt. I'm going to select the row that I want to quilt. And I'm going to be very careful when I get over to the edge of the no-sew zone because I don't remember what I touched yesterday, and I'm going to be ready to shut it off in the event that I hit continuous sewing by mistake and it starts sewing across the field of the quilt. So I'm ready to do that. Isn't this rose fabric really beautiful? I am really close to the edge of my no-sew zone, so I'm ready to hit my pause button just in case anything goes the way that I don't want it to go. And that would be stitching across. And here comes the test. Okay, when I clip this and hit start again, it should just travel across to the other side of the quilt to do the other border, which is what I want. And this is what is ideal. Once it works its way over here, we could go ahead and pull up the bobbin thread, and then it will sew across this 10 inches. Then I can roll up the quilt, realign, create a new no-sew zone, and we can move on to the next section. And you can see we're really beautifully right here on the edge of my outer and inner border. But I want you to keep in mind that I had used the ruler right on the edge. And we're like, that was almost right on the seam. So I'm really happy I gave myself that extra 1/4 of an inch. And this section here is only going to take 2.5 minutes, so I'm going to speculate that that means about 5 minutes per row of stitching. So hopefully in the next hour I can have the quilt finished. These roses are really popping on the camera, and this fabric really is as beautiful in person as it looks on screen. Now I'm going to go through all my normal steps for advancing the quilt. Taking out my side tension. Pulling out my needle. Clipping my bobbin thread. I can't go to the middle of the quilt this time because there's no design there. So here close to the edge, I'm going to drop my needle in the quilt, release the tension while holding the roller so it doesn't spring and jerk the quilt, release the top take-up lever, roll the quilt back, reintroduce the top take-up roller tension, retension the bottom, make sure that the quilt is not wrinkled. I'm going to redo my side tension. I know you can see that my batting extends all the way out to the same size as the backing. And the reason I do that, when the quilt rolls up over here, this part is not loose, creating a tension problem for the edges of the quilt. So this edge with the batting, the surplus of the backing, is as tight as the body of the quilt. And for me, this piece of batting here that will be a waste is the cost of doing business. My quilt is back in tension. So So I'm going to go ahead and go to the other side. I'm going to realign, zoom in, zoom in. I'm going to find something that I've already sewn and use that as my alignment point. It's going to be the inside vein of, turn off my zoom, touch my reference point, which is the very tip of the vein of a leaf. And now I'm going to go back to my start position of this next row. Well, actually I have to select the next pattern to sew. I've done that. I'm going to stop to cut threads. Sew quilt. I've done my bobbins, pull up my bobbin thread. We're on manual. So it says 7.7 minutes for the whole piece per row. So I'm going to say 7 minutes, almost 8 minutes per row instead of 5. So it's close. So we'll go ahead and repeat the same process as we did for the last row. I brought the head of the machine over to the other side. I've realigned it. I've already selected, while I was over on the right hand side, the next row to quilt. You can see that it's this row here, and I don't have a no-sew zone there yet. So I've hit the back button until I could get to this screen, and I'm going to add edit block, add block, no-sew zone, and I'm going to select the pattern that will be affected. That one's already done. I'm going to go ahead and select that one, even though I'm not sure if it goes down that far. And now I'm going to go ahead and mark on quilt. And I'm going to do the same process that I have done, using my ruler right on the edge of the seam between the inner border and the outer border, as low as I can go with the head of the machine. And now I'm going to slowly go to the other side, do the other side, close the block, and we'll have a no-sew zone. You can see in pink my new no-sew zone that I just created. I'm going to hit finished. That's going to blank that out. So I can, I'm going to tie off my transition. And now I can go ahead and hit finished and sew quilt. It's going to let me do the next row. And I'm just going to double check where I'm at. So I know that it's this one here that we're going to be sewing. And I'm going to hit continue, sew quilt. It goes right to my start position, pulls up the bobbin thread. And we're ready to sew. Now I'll get my ruler off of the table. So it's really just a matter of following the steps. Once we get to the edge, it'll have me cut the threads, and then it will scan to the other side and finish. This one says it's got 6 minutes. So I understand why the last row said it was 7.7. I hadn't done the no-sew zone yet. It was going to sew a portion of the design across the bottom because it was at the bottom of the no-sew zone. But I just stopped the machine and went to the other side and restarted it. So it did take the same amount of time, but I did catch the little mistake I made. One of the also nice things about this part, because I had already quilted the body of the quilt, I had already basted the edges of the quilt all the way down to the length, and the top is no longer attached at the top take-up bar, which is the one that hangs below the machine frame. So because I've already quilted all the way to the bottom on the body. So that's one less thing that I have to worry about. Actually two, the basting on the sides and the bottom and the additional take-up lever. I have a habit of pulling out loose threads in between the seams. I wonder if other quilters do that same thing. I'm always amazed at how many little tiny threads there are in between the seams. And I have to give high praise to the designer of Fanfare. I believe it was Patricia Ritter on this one. I'd have to look to be sure. But this whole collection's really stunning. Okay, now we're going to clip the thread and push start again, and it's going to robot itself away to the other side and start on the other side of the quilt. By adding these no-sew zones on each row, I'm able to make sure that I have a really accurate placement on each side. So it's going to go quick like this for all of the body of the quilt. It'll take a little bit longer when I get to the very bottom edge of the bottom of the quilt, because I'm going to have a lot more stops and starts and clip the thread. But again, I'd much rather do that than have the buildup of thread from the continuous sewing. So I'm going to keep going, and I'll bring you in when we get to the bottom. So I've gotten down to the bottom of the quilt. I'm going to start my last no-sew zone. It's only going to be a few inches larger than the one that we already have. One thing I want to do when I'm finished is show you. You may be able to see a little bit here, but each of my no-sew zones is off from the one above it. And that's because every time I roll the quilt shifts a little bit. Maybe it wasn't loaded perfectly straight or perpendicular to the frame, or maybe the quilt itself just wasn't straight all the way. But you'll see that that's why it's really important to go ahead and put these no-sew zones in one row at a time. So I'm going to touch the row that's going to be affected. I'm going to touch all of them just to be sure. And I'm going to start up here where above where the other one is, so they connect. I'm going to mark on quilt and start marking. Again, I have the edge of my ruler right on the edge of the seam between the outer border and inner border. And I'm going to do a lot of these little marks along the bottom to make sure that we get a really accurate line. And I will have a lot of stop and starts on the bottom, but this is the last time. And I really like the way that we have no buildup of the overstitching from doing the continuous thread, continuous stitching. I'm really only going about every 2 or 3 inches, but you could do as many of these as you wanted. Close block and hit finished. You can see my new no-sew zone and my final no-sew zone. So I'm going to hit finished, except this transition where I'm going to tie off, and hit finished. So quilt, what's the next pattern we're going to do? I'm going to move the head of my machine just to make sure, so I know which one we're doing. And hit continue. So quilt, it's going to move to the start. And let me pull up the bobbin thread. Now we should have the no-sew zone, which will do, I think, a little bit of stitching across the bottom. I won't know till we get over there a little bit further. I'll only have to roll up the quilt one more time because there's only a few inches of the bottom that aren't accessible to the machine at the moment. I also will be able to use my adjust feature at the bottom because I know I've added more rows than what I needed, and I can use the head of the machine to put the needle at the bottom of the quilt, and then I can snap to that line. Now here's where I'm going to have some a series of jump stitches to get across the bottom. And I'm just going to keep raising the needle and hitting start and letting it go across and do those. It says we have 3.5 minutes left for this whole row. I'm going to adjust the quilt now. So I'm going to hit the adjust button, and you can see that I'm going to put the foot at the very bottom of my quilt, and I have my crosshairs there. So I'm going to touch the dashed line and just move it up until it's even with the crosshairs and hit finished. And then I can go back to my start line. It's going to pull up the thread. Now this is almost a full row of stitching, so now we're finally going to have 21 minutes of stitching as this pattern goes all the way across the bottom of the quilt. And I think once we're finished, we'll have one more little tiny bit of stitching to do, a partial row. I'm not going to make you watch the full 21 minutes. Maybe we'll come back in on that partial row. But I can say that we're really at the finish line of this project, and I've had this quilt on my frame for 2 weeks because I was going slow and steady, and I'm really happy with the results. The very last row was just a very small partial row, and I forgot to hit continuous stitching. I still had it on stop to cut threads. So I had like a million stop to cut threads across the bottom, so I didn't bore you with that. But we have come to the completion of this part of this quilt. We had the no-sew zone around both the pillow tuck and the body of the quilt. Each no-sew zone that I created, even though I used the ruler to line it up exactly with the quilt, looked different on the screen. It was either shifted to the left or shifted to the right. And that's just a product of moving the quilt on the rollers. So that's why I would not use some kind of a shape or block to do the whole quilt, because it would never line up. Doing the no-sew zone for me, row by row, was the best way to do it. And with a panto this size, 10.5 inches, I really had to do it every single row. So I had to select the next row, realign it after I rolled it up, create a new no-sew zone, and then go back to the start for that new sewing row. I did select clip in between, so it just sewed the left and the right, and traveled across the quilt in the middle. So I'm really pleased how it came out. I only made one tiny little mistake somewhere, and I'm not sure because I only caught it afterwards, but it stitched a little bit on the inner border, but I've already gone ahead and picked that out. I also have a few jump stitches on the bobbin thread that I'll have to cut, but overall I'm very pleased. Not to boast on my part, because I feel like I'm finally getting a little bit more competent on the software, but this is the best finish that I've had, with so many different steps in the process. So we had the blocks, quarter square triangle, half square triangle, and the alternating blocks, stitch in the ditch, and then the border with the no-sew zone around both the pillow tuck and the body of the quilt, and no major problems. The stitching on the back is really beautiful, stitching on the front is really beautiful, and the only thread breaks I had in this entire quilt were when the bobbin ran out, and that's to be expected. I don't use the bobbin counter because it was so inaccurate, so I just let the bobbin run out, and then the IQ will alert me a few seconds after the bobbin runs out. Many of you knew that a while back I was having a lot of thread break issues. In fact, I've had thread break issues since I've had this machine, and I kept trying to attribute it to different things. I did have a problem with the check spring. At one point, the spring in the bobbin case came out one day when the bobbin fell, and I didn't realize it right away. But the check spring problem was 2 or 3 times. But I tried adjusting the speed of the IQ, the speed of the sewing machine, and sometimes you would get a little bit of a fix on it. But ultimately, what it turns out is that it was the foot. The ruler foot that I had on my machine was a special foot, and it must have had burrs on it. And so I quit using it, and immediately after I quit using it, the thread breaks ended. So I have retired that particular foot, and my machine now is running at the speed that I used to always have it running at. I haven't adjusted the tension since then. I haven't adjusted the speed of the IQ or the Bernina itself, and it's sewing beautifully. So for me, I'm attributing it to that foot. I'm saying problem solved, and I'm going to go ahead and get this quilt off of the frame because I know she's very excited to get it back. This is going to give her 4 or 5 days to put the binding on it before the guild meeting, and I know that she's going to want to take it to the guild meeting and show it off, and I don't blame her because it really is beautiful. All comes down to her piecing, her block selection, and the fabric. This rose fabric, really intoxicating. And maybe one day I'll tell you why I like rose fabric so much. But until then, we're finished in the studio today. Thanks for following along, for those of you who did. And we look forward to seeing you here in the studio again next time. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other.